My parents and their 6 children lived in a small village of Benvir, Alsace, France. On December 3, 1944, we heard in the distance rumbling like thunder. We knew that the Allies were approaching, and there was great excitement among the villagers. The Americans came fighting over the Vosges Mountains and needed a well-deserved rest. They stopped 2 miles from our village. There were no Germans in our village at that time. Can you understand? I was a 15-year-old boy at this time, working as an apprentice to become a professional cabinet maker. On the 4th of December, I was riding my bike home that evening from my apprenticeship, and the streets were packed with excited neighbors, talking about the Americans are coming. The villagers had their wine barrels filled to the brim because that year was a good harvest for grapes. My father had made a special barrel full of the most delicious Gewürztraminer wine. Only the best was good enough for the Americans that were coming. The entire village was ready to toast our liberators and eagerly anticipating their arrival. My son will continue.
This is my dad's story. In the early morning of December the 5th, 2 shells exploded in our neighborhood. When we heard the shells explode, we ran for shelter to the basement of the local convent. After a long pause of no shelling, the men wandered out of the shelter and went back to their homes to feed their livestock. Since no shells fell the rest of the day, my younger brother John twisted our dad's arm to let us sleep in his own bed at home that night. I went with him so that he would not be alone. After midnight, the artillery shelling started again non-stop. My brother and I were scared stiff. The house window shutters were ripped open. The neighbor's house was hit on the window, and while only a cloud curtain could be seen flying in the wind. The next morning, December the 6th, the Germans arrived in our village and took up residence in villagers' homes and in the basement of the schoolhouse. The bombing had continued from that day before. During a lull in the bombing, my father came over to the house to check on my brother and me. He was happy to see us safe and wanted us to take us. During a lull in the bombing, my father came over to the house to check on my brother and me. He was happy to see us safe and wanted to take us back to the shelter. First, we had breakfast together, and then my father had prayer with us before we left. On our way out, my father fed the 5 goats in our stable. They were becoming very restless. After feeding the goats, my father, brother, and I walked back to the shelter. The shelling continued all through the day. My younger brother, Gene, did not realize the seriousness of what was happening around us and that war was not a game. He wanted us to visit his best friend across town. Between shelling, he ran to his friend's home, which was situated on an elevated lot. This friend took us to the 2nd floor window so that we could see where the shelling was coming from. After a few minutes, we left to go to the shelter. As we were running back, we turned to look at the house we had just left and noticed that the window we had just been standing in had been hit by a shell, and what was once a window was now a gaping hole. Luckily, no one in the house was hurt, and neither were we. Picking up our pace, we made it back to the shelter. On crossing the convent courtyard, everything was helter-skelter. In the debris, I found my father's bloody cap with 2 holes in it. A cold chill went down my spine. We crossed the courtyard and went into the cellar, where the occupants could be heard saying the Hail Mary. A kind lady said, "It is your father." Your mother, with the help of 2 German soldiers, took him over to the school cellar. The school was located across the street from the convent. We rushed over there and found my dad lying in the furnace room. My mother was kneeling beside him. She looked up at us and said, "Had you been here?" and she didn't finish the sentence. We never asked what she meant. The German command post had been installed in the school cellar, so my mother asked the commander if they could provide transportation to the nearest hospital. He said that he couldn't, but he did give my father a shot for pain. My father died 2 hours later. He was 48 years old and was the first civilian casualty of the liberation of our village. It was a very distressful time. My father's brother and a neighbor placed my father on a ladder and took him to our house. I walked beside him so that he wouldn't fall off. Our house was only separated from the school by a stone wall behind our house. They placed my father on his bed, hoping to be able to bury him the next day after our liberation. The next day, December 7th, my mother and I went to the house so that she could wash my dad and dress him in his best suit for burial. It was very, very heartbreaking, especially when we saw the 2 shrapnel holes in his head and the 2 shrapnel holes in his chest. After we had finished, we placed him gently back onto the bed. On December the 11th, our street was burning. Houses were attached one to the other, and our house burned at midnight with my father's body still lying on the bed. Because of all the shelling, we had never been able to properly bury him. My mother made me promise never to leave this shelter cellar again, and I promised.